That is, without a doubt, one of the most recognizable pieces of music of the 20th century. I don't think there's a comedy team more beloved than Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. One of my enduring moments of childhood was rushing home after school every day to watch Laurel and Hardy's Hal Roach Sound Era shorts on Channel 11. They weren't just funny. They were pounding on the floor, laughing so hard you couldn't breathe funny. Well, our guest today is Laurel and Hardy historian and author Randy Skretvedt. The revised and updated edition of his book, Laurel and Hardy, The Magic Behind the Movies, is the definitive look at the world's greatest comedy team. Randy, welcome to the show, and can you tell us how you first discovered Laurel and Hardy?
Well, I was born in November of 1958. I'm almost 58 years old. And I, as a very, very early kid, I had already discovered the Universal monster movies on television.
Right.
I'd seen the Three Stooges. I had seen the later Our Gang comedies, the late 30s ones.
Sure.
But they weren't showing Laurel and Hardy as yet until there was one magic week where one of our local stations out here, Channel 9, KHJ-TV, they had a show called The $1 Million Movie. And they must have had a very small film library because they would run the same movie every night.
Every night.
For the whole week. And I must have caught it either Sunday or Monday because the film I caught was called The Golden Age of Comedy.
Right.
And it was a compilation made by a man named Robert Youngson of the best moments from a lot of the Hal Roach and Mack Sennett silent comedies of the late 20s with a pretty heavy emphasis on Laurel and Hardy. And as I say, I must have caught it very early in the week because I made a point to watch it every night for the rest of the week. And by the end of that week, I was just, sworn to the faith at 5 years old. Laurel and Hardy were now it. They had supplanted the Universal monster movies in my affections. And not too long after that same station began showing, as you were saying, they began showing the Laurel and Hardy sound short subjects.
Right.
I think at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then they showed them again at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So very quickly, I was able to see a pretty good chunk of Laurel and Hardy's output. Because they not only had the short subjects, they also chopped up the feature films and made them into ersatz short subjects.
Yes, right, yep.
And so I remember one day, I was just about 6 years old, I was getting ready for school, second grade, I was in the kitchen, and I was sort of prattling on about Laurel and Hardy, as I always was, and I remember saying to my mom, gee, I wonder if Laurel or Hardy are still alive, because I knew at that point, even then, those films were about 30 years old.
Right.
And just after I'd said that, my dad brought in the Los Angeles Times, and on the front page it said, Stan Laurel, 74, film comedian, dies at home. And it was so spooky because I had just said, gee, I wonder if Laurel or Hardy are still alive, and there was my answer.
Wow.
So I think that might have, made me want to meet and talk to anybody who was still around who could tell me about the making of these films, because I was just fascinated by them, and I wanted to know more about them. And, I just missed meeting Stan Laurel, So a few years after that, when I was about 12, I found out about the local chapter of Sons of the Desert, which in Los Angeles was called the Way Out West Tent. Every chapter of the Sons of the Desert, which is an international Laurel and Hardy appreciation society, every chapter is named after one of the Laurel and Hardy movies.
Right.
And so the Los Angeles one appropriately was Way Out West. I got the address. I wrote and asked if I could have permission to join. You were supposed to be 16 years old in order to join the club, but the secretary, a lady named Lori Jones, bless her heart, she bent the rules and she let me in at age 12. And I'm so grateful that she did, because I was able to meet a lot of people who wouldn't have been around by the time I was 16. I got to meet at that first meeting Joe Rock, who produced a lot of Stan's solo comedies before he teamed up with Hardy.
Right.
I got to meet Stan's second wife, Ruth. And I got to meet a man who became a good friend of mine for many years, Marvin Hatley, who wrote the Cuckoo song, the Laurel and Hardy theme song, as well as a lot of the background scores. So that was in August of 1971, and I became, a very fervent member of that group all the way through I still go to their meetings, so I'm still a member after all these years.
We're talking with author and historian Randy Skretvedt today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. His book is called Laurel Hardy, The Magic Behind the Movies. You mentioned the Cuckoo song, and later it became more famous as Laurel Hardy's theme music, but there's an interesting story behind that, isn't there?
Well, at one point, starting in 1929, the Hal Roach Studios, when they were getting ready to produce sound motion pictures, they had an affiliation with the Victor Talking Machine Company. In fact, the great jazzman Lionel Hampton made his first records at the Hal Roach Studios.
Wow.
Because it was a Victor record, and that's where Victor was recording at that point. And there was also a radio station housed there for a while, which was radio station KFVD. Kind of strange call letters, but there you are. and and they had a show in the morning called the Happy-Go-Lucky Trio. And it was three multi-talented musicians who could play just about any instrument. Marvin Hatley, a guy named Vern Trimble, and another one named Art Stevenson. And people would call in and try to stump them by having them play a given tune, and that they could play it on the appropriate instruments. And so Marvin told me many years later, he said, well, you know, we could play Mexican music on mandolins, and we could play hot jazz, and we could play just about everything because each of us could play all these instruments. But it was a morning show on from 7 to 9 in the morning, and because people were getting ready for work while they were listening to it, they would do what Marvin called a musical time signal. And I think every 10 or 15 minutes they would play this thing that sounded like a little musical cuckoo clock.
Right.
Where the one part of it was going do 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 do, and then on the other hand was going diddle 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 diddle. Well, Stan Laurel was having breakfast one day at the Our Gang Cafe, which was a restaurant on the Hal Roach lot.
Right.
And they were playing the radio, KFVD, over the speaker system in the restaurant. And Stan heard this, and he thought, that would be a very appropriate theme song for us. So he went and talked to Marvin and said, you know, can we use that? And I think they paid Marvin $50 or something for the privilege of using that as their theme song, which, of course, they used for the rest of their careers.
Right.
But Marvin told me that they recorded it, when they began using it for the films, they recorded it on 2 clarinets, and he showed me how to play it on piano. And he says, it sounds funny because basically the right hand is in the key of F and the left hand is in the key of G. And he says the clash of the major second intervals is what makes it funny. But anyway, it was not written as the Laurel and Hardy theme song. It was written as a radio musical cuckoo clock to let people know what time it was on this radio show.
I think by now everyone realizes that Stan Laurel was the comedy genius behind all of their gags, but I think Oliver Hardy, or Babe as everyone called him, gets short shrift. When I'm watching a Laurel and Hardy film, I can't take my eyes off of him. He was certainly the greatest comic actor of his day, and maybe of all time.
I would agree with you. He was almost exclusively a film actor. He did do a few stage shows in school when he was a boy. But Stan, of course, had been in the music halls and in vaudeville from 1906 through the early 20s, and so he had a lot of stage experience, and because of that, his performances tended to be broader because they were intended for a stage audience, and of course, when you're on the stage, you're not magnified like you are when you're in a motion picture.
Right.
Whereas Babe, who really began his acting career in earnest as a film actor when he was 22 years old, he knew how to scale everything down for motion pictures and do everything very subtly. And he really knew that camera and how his performance would relate to it. And, you know, that's why you find him doing the looks to the camera, even in very early films before he teamed with Stan. There's some going back to 1916 where he's doing the looks to the camera.
Right.
So that was a key part of his comedy equipment very, very early. But yeah, he's a wonderful actor. And even when you compare him to dramatic actors of that time, he comes across as being so genuine and so real.
Yes.
And also the fact that he makes a point of acknowledging us in the audience so many times with those looks to the camera. I think that's another reason why we react so well and we have so much empathy for him. When you really think about it, the the person with whom Ollie communicates best isn't Stan, and it isn't any of his on-screen wives. It's you.
Yes, absolutely.
It's you who are watching him. You're the one person in the world who really understands him,
Right.
and you have this sort of communication going on that he doesn't have even with any of the other people in the film at that point.
Right.
So I think that's a key component of their appeal. And the other thing, of course, is I always say that we laugh at other comedians, but we love Laurel and Hardy. And
Right.
I think the reason we love them so much is because they love each other so much. There's a real bond between those two characters. And my favorite scene in any Laurel and Hardy film is in a film called Blockheads, where Laurel and Hardy have been soldiers together in World War I and have been separated for 20 years. And Ollie finds out that Stan has just returned from the war. Nobody told him that it was over. And so he's at the soldiers' home nearby, and Ollie goes to pay him a visit. And they have this wonderful scene where they, have this reintroduction after 20 years, and they're just making small talk, but really the unspoken dialogue is, I love you and I've missed you for 20 years.
Right.
And, it's just so beautifully played, and you just think, what other comedy team would even think of doing a scene like this,
Right.
without then making fun of it at the end or something. And they don't. They play it absolutely seriously.
Ollie!
Stan, don't get up now. Sit right there.
How'd you know I was here?
I saw your picture in the paper.
Did you?
Yeah.
How'd I look?
Well, you haven't changed a bit.
Neither of you, too. If I hadn't have seen you, I never would have known you. Gee, I'm glad to see you.
I'm glad to see you, too.
Have you missed me all this time?
I certainly have.
I missed you, too.
It's interesting because sometimes people have said, oh, look at, whenever these two are together, it's always a disaster. Why do they hang out together? And I say, well, because they don't have anybody else.
Right, exactly.
They're best friends.
A very perceptive point. Yeah, they're like two children who never quite grew up. They're also like two men who are sort of out of their time because they have these courtly manners that sort of belong to the 1890s, and they wear these old outmoded stand-up collars and derbies, which even then were old-fashioned. They're not quite of the Roaring 20s or the gritty 1930s. They seem to be from a few decades before that, and they're trying to cope as best they can with the modes and manners of the 1920s and 30s.
Laurel and Hardy historian and author Randy Skretvedt in just a moment. We're back talking with author Randy Skretvedt. His revised and updated edition of Laurel and Hardy, The Magic Behind the Movies, is available now at Amazon.com. Randy, as I understand it, Laurel and Hardy weren't exactly close friends, per se. They didn't have any real friction, but they were more or less business partners, right?
Well, that's true early on in their relationship. In fact, I think one reason why they got along so well when they were working together is that they just never saw each other unless they were at the studio. They really did not socialize with each other, apart from working together, because Babe loved to golf, and Babe had many friends in many different circles. He liked to build furniture. He had a garden that he tended to. He liked to go to the racetrack and lose a lot of money. Whereas Stan's whole life was working with the writers on the script for the film, or working with Burt Jordan, who was a film editor, working on cutting the films. The only thing that Stan did outside of the studio was go fishing at Catalina Island, which he did fairly frequently. And Babe was not much of a fisherman. So they were friendly, and of course they had this wonderful, seamless working partnership as far as their ability as actors and their ability to anticipate each other's reactions. But they were not really close friends until the later 1940s, when movie studios were more interested in making gritty film noir movies and westerns and really weren't interested in making comedies anymore. And so Laurel and Hardy found themselves working primarily in Europe doing stage shows. And, of course, at that point, they had to pretty much live hand in glove with each other, because they were, traveling on a steamship to England or to Belgium or Denmark, wherever they were playing. They and their wives were together all the time. And they found, to their great delight, that their friendship really blossomed at that point. So the nice thing about Laurel and Hardy is that unlike most comedy teams who start out as fast friends and gradually
Yes.
become less than fast friends, Laurel and Hardy's relationship got better and better and better as the years went by.
A Pathé cameraman ran into a couple of old friends, Oliver Hardy and Stan Laurel, on their way to the Capitol for the Royal Command performance. And Mr. Laurel was being as difficult as ever.
What is it? You're standing on my foot. Oh, I'm sorry.
We're talking to author Randy Skretvedt. His revised and updated book is called Laurel and Hardy, The Magic Behind the Movies. And it's a good thing this is a revised book because, as I understand it, over the years, some Laurel and Hardy films that were considered lost have since been uncovered.
Well, yeah, back in the early 70s, there were several Laurel and Hardy films that were missing. But over the years, we've found one called Duck Soup, not to be confused with the Marx Brothers movie. It's a very, very early Laurel and Hardy film, and what's surprising about it is that they are teamed all the way through it. They really are very close to the Laurel and Hardy that we know and love in the mature films.
Right.
So that was found, I think, in Belgium. And then in France, they found another very early one called Why Girls Love Sailors. And then there's a Laurel and Hardy film that they made for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer called The Rogue Song.
Yes.
They weren't the stars of it. It was a Technicolor extravaganza starring the Metropolitan Opera star Lawrence Tibbett. And they thought they had finished the film, and then they looked at it, and then producer Irving Thalberg thought, this is really too somber. We need some comedy relief. And so he asked Hal Roach if they could borrow Laurel and Hardy and have them put in 10 minutes worth of gags just sort of spotted throughout the film, which Laurel and Hardy did. Unfortunately, most of that film is missing. We do have the complete soundtrack because the soundtrack was on discs.
Right.
And there's about 400 stills, and there's maybe 15 minutes worth of footage of it that has shown up over the years. But we're still looking for that one. And we're also still looking for an early Laurel and Hardy two-reeler called Hats Off, in which Laurel and Hardy are washing machine salesmen carrying a washing machine up a long, long, long flight of steps. And if that sounds kind of familiar,
Sure.
It's because it was the precursor to a later film called The Music Box, in which Laurel and Hardy are piano delivery men having to carry a piano up that very same long, long, long flight of steps. And another discovery that was found just recently was the complete second reel of a film called The Battle of the Century, which features the epic Laurel and Hardy pie fight.
Sure.
Now, I mentioned this film called The Golden Age of Comedy, which was the first exposure I had to Laurel and Hardy as a little kid.
Right.
That film pretty much finishes with a 3 or 4 minute condensation of the pie fight sequence. And for years, that's the only footage that we had of that movie was just that little 4 minute clip that was used by Robert Youngson for his compilation, The Golden Age of Comedy. Well, turns out sometime in the 1970s, Leonard Maltin found most of the first reel. It was sort of hiding in plain sight at the Museum of Modern Art. It was there in their archives all along, just nobody had bothered to look for it. So they found that, and then just last year, a man named John Marsalis was going through a collection that had already gone through 3 or 4 other collectors over the years, and he saw this can of film saying Battle of the Century, Reel 2, and he thought, oh, well, that's probably just the little clip of the pie fight that we've always had.
Right.
And he actually decided, well, I'll run it, and he realized, no, it was the complete second reel, which we could have had it 25 years ago if anybody had bothered to open up the film can.
Wow.
So turns out Robert Youngson had made a complete copy of the second reel when he was doing this film, The Golden Age of Comedy. So now we have almost all of that film after all these years. It's still missing about 2 minutes at the end of reel 1, but they bridge that gap with some photographs.
Right.
So we now have almost the complete film after all these years. And I mentioned Leonard Maltin finding most of the first reel. There is a Leonard Maltin connection and a Laurel and Hardy connection to Teaneck, New Jersey. Leonard Maltin's first love, the way he got introduced to old movies, was Laurel and Hardy. And, of course, he's always been a big booster of the team. And, of course, now he's renowned for knowing just about everything there is to know about old movies or new movies.
Right.
But Laurel and Hardy were his first loves cinematically. And when he was 14, he got permission from Laurel and Hardy's official biographer, a man named John McCabe, who was sort of the official clearinghouse guy for Sons of the Desert, the Laurel and Hardy fan club. Leonard Maltin, at age 14, started the first junior Sons of the Desert tent, which was for kids, and it was the tit-for-tat tent of Teaneck, New Jersey.
How about that?
So there you go. That's he was the first junior Grand Sheik of a Sons of the Desert tent when he was 14 years old, and it was in Teaneck, New Jersey. So there you go.
Do you all solemnly swear to be present at our 87th annual convention at Chicago?
I do.
Me too.
Wholeheartedly unanimous.
Historian Randy Skretvedt, his book, Laurel and Hardy, The Magic Behind the Movies, has been revised and updated, and it's a good thing, too, because there aren't a lot of new Laurel and Hardy books these days. There was a kind of classic comedy craze in the 60s and 70s, and that's when you could trip over books about Laurel and Hardy, but they were primarily picture books.
Right. There was a book called The Films of Laurel and Hardy by William K. Everson.
Yes.
Which is primarily a picture book, although the text in it is very nice, but it's rather brief. And there actually was a guy named Richard J. Anobili who he made a whole career out of books that were frame blow-ups from the actual film, and then he would just print the actual dialogue from the soundtrack. So those books had some sort of utility value in the days before home video, but then when video came in, you could actually get the movie, so you didn't really need those books anymore.
Right.
I had discovered Laurel and Hardy in 1964, so as I was growing up, those books were coming out, and they were, adding to my knowledge of the boys and fueling my imagination. And so, I grew up right in that particular time when the 60s and early 70s, when all those film books were starting to come out. But back at that point, I read a book by a guy named Joe Adamson called Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and sometimes Zeppo. Mm-hmm. And it was the first movie book I'd ever read, which was really about the production of movies, the differences between the script and the final film, and things that happened on the set. And I thought, I'm blessed to be a member of the Los Angeles tent of Sons of the Desert, and a lot of the people who worked with Laurel and Hardy every day at the Roach Studios go to those meetings just as members, and I'm sure they have stories about this sort of thing. So anyway, I began doing interviews with the Laurel and Hardy people at the Way Out West tent of the Sons of the Desert when I was about 13 or 14, bringing my little reel-to-reel tape recorder and then later a cassette recorder, and just sneaking little surreptitious interviews when I could. When I got my driver's license at 16, then I started tearing all around the San Fernando Valley and Tarzana and Encino and North Hollywood and Toluca Lake, and getting actual sit-down interviews with these people, because I wanted to get these stories preserved. They were already in their 70s and 80s.
Sure.
When I was in my teens, and, I knew they weren't going to be around forever. So that was the first item of the business, was to get the interviews done. And then I discovered that there were scripts for Laurel and Hardy films. There were a whole bunch of them at the college that I happened to be going to, at Cal State Fullerton. They had the papers of a director named Fred Gill, who had done a lot of the early Laurel and Hardy films. His scripts were there. Then in 1980, I found a memorabilia dealer who had a whole bunch of other scripts, and he wouldn't let me photocopy them, but he would let me sit in the back of his store and dictate them into my tape recorder. So he was only open on Saturdays. So for about 5 or 6 successive Saturdays, I had to drive all the way from my home in Orange County up to Hollywood, which is about 35 miles one way, and sit outside on an upended milk crate and dictate these scripts into my little cassette recorder as fast as I could, because he had a lot of them.
Right.
And by 1979, I had enough to write a book. And so between 1979 and 1986, I wrote the first edition of the book, which came out in the spring of 1987. It got good reviews. We got a nice review from the New York Times. It sold very well. We eventually sold about 25,000 copies, which is really good for a film book like this. Mm-hmm. And then in 1994, I did an update of it with about 35 pages of new material, because some new films, some of the foreign language films, had been rediscovered, for one thing, and I wanted to mention that. But about 10 years ago, I realized that, the book was really not anymore the ultimate reference book that I had wanted it to be. And also with the rise of the internet and so much material on the internet, there was so much more material that was readily available to me. I didn't have to go all the way up to the Beverly Hills to the Motion Picture Academy library and go through old trade papers again like I'd done the first time around. Now there is a whole bunch of that stuff that would come to me through my computer. There's a lot of it that you can just find online. So I thought, well, there's so many more resources now. I basically have to rewrite this from the ground up. So anyway, the short answer is, after this long circumlocucious non-answer,
sure.
The original book was 464 pages, I think, and it was a 6x9 book. The new one is 8.5 by 11, and it's 632 pages, and we have twice as much text and 4 times as many photographs as the original book had. Wow. Because the original one had about 250. Now we have 1,000 photographs in it. And almost all of the photos have not been previously published. A lot of them are from Oliver Hardy's personal collection, which I was able to purchase in 1979. So there are a lot of one-of-a-kind photos there from, you could just see him at the studio with friends, and you see him on vacations, and you see his family, and all sorts of things like that. So we have quite a few rarities in the book.
So, in other words, you have quite the Laurel and Hardy memorabilia collection.
Oh, well, I've been collecting Laurel and Hardy memorabilia since I was a little kid. My bedroom is still awash in Laurel and Hardy trinkets and statues and toys and all that sort of thing. Then, getting to know a wonderful lady named Venice Lloyd. She was the widow of Laurel and Hardy's longtime cameraman, Art Lloyd. We'd gotten to know each other for about 6 months and had become very fast friends. And this was around Christmas time of 1980, and she said, Artie brought this home from the studio one day, and we've been using it as a Christmas decoration ever since, but I think you should have it. And then she gave me the last remaining, as far as I know, the last remaining soldier from Babes in Toyland, from the platoon that the platoon that saved Toyland from the bogeymen. And it actually, because they did a stop-action animation sequence for that. So, in other words, they had all these models. It stands 1 foot high. It's made out of metal. And the one I have carries a rifle. There were some that had bugles, some that had drums. The soldiers came in different types. But they did a stop-action animation thing where you see them marching, all these different little toy figures. So I have the last man standing from the Babes in Toyland platoon. And another thing which I do have is I do have an original fez from the movie Sons of the Desert, in which Laurel and Hardy belonged to this fraternal organization, which is kind of like the Shriners, where they wear fezzes. And so I've had that now for 34 years.
Wow.
And so that's that. In fact, I know another collector, another guy who actually has the one that Stan wore, because it has a sticker on the inside front that says Stan Laurel. And it actually still has some of the pancake makeup that Stan wore on the brim of the, of the fez. So I said, you've got Stan Laurel's DNA on that, probably.
Right, we can start cloning them.
Yes, exactly.
If people wanted to get the book, where would be the best place to get the book?
Well, there are two venues. One is, of course, Amazon. But make sure that you get the new one, the hardcover, because they still do have used copies of the old paperback. We don't have a paperback yet of the new one. There will be one, sometime next year. I don't know exactly when, but the deluxe version, the hardcover, is available from Amazon.com. And again, it's called Laurel and Hardy: The Magic Behind the Movies. You want the one that has this sort of sandy-colored cover with the blue, the picture with the color picture with the blue background on the back and a sandy-colored border around it. That's the hardcover. That's the new one.
Right.
And again, my last name is Skretvedt, Skretvedt, Randy Skretvedt. And that's one way. But then if you get it from the publisher directly, you will get not only a copy personally autographed to you by me, but you will also get a bonus compact disc, which features 75 minutes of my interview tapes with various Laurel and Hardy people. And so you get to hear Oliver Hardy's widow, and you get to hear both of the Laurel and Hardy film editors, Richard Currier and Bert Jordan, And the man who wrote the Cuckoo song will explain to you how he wrote the Cuckoo song, and he'll also play for you Honolulu Baby on hot jazz piano. That's from Sons of the Desert. So that's a bonus CD that you can only get from the publisher, and you get that by going to www.bonaventure, BONAVENTURE, bonaventurepress.com, bonaventurepress.com, and that'll give you full information about ordering it direct, and that way you'll get the autograph and you'll get the special bonus CD.
Randy, I worry about young people today and future generations. There doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in Laurel and Hardy movies, or maybe I'm wrong.
Well, happily, when I go to Sons of the Desert meetings, I've been going to several of them in the Southern California area. There are several different chapters. And usually there are a fairly healthy number of younger people, and there's starting to be more and more theatrical screenings going on around the country, too. And I notice a lot of parents are bringing their kids, so that's a very good sign, because, kids will still fall in love with Laurel and Hardy if they're given the opportunity to see them.
Right.
So we got to bring them to schools and libraries and do everything we can to get kids to see Laurel and Hardy, because they are one of the great pleasures of life.
Absolutely. Randy, thanks so much. This has been my kind of discussion, I'll say that. Best of luck with the book, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Well, here's another nice mess you've gotten me into.